Hello, everyone. My name is Hugh Garry. I'm just trying to find the right talk to share with you at the moment, so bear with me one moment. I think this is the right one. Yes. Okay. So Sarah, can you see that changing? Because I've had problems with this in the past. So it was all black, but now you can. Okay, if I do that now, is it changing okay? Yep, fab. Okay, well, let's go back to the beginning then. Sorry about that. My name is Hugh Garry. I run a company called Story Things. We help good people tell important stories in fascinating ways. And what I mean by that is, sorry, just need to get this chat off screen. And what I mean by that is, so we work with lots of nonprofits, charities, foundations, people who are generally trying to do good in the world. We think they're telling important stories. If we do work with big corporate clients, but generally when we are working with them, we're helping them tell good stories or important stories or CSR stories, things that we think are nudging the world into a slightly better place. And when we talk about fascinating ways, we don't have a specific way of telling stories. We don't just make podcasts. We make things in all different kinds of ways. This is a series that we've been running with Experian called Identities of the World. And this has been a mixture of animation, films, and journalism. This is something that we did with a client called Pearson. And this started out as a podcast, but it then became a platform for lesser told stories, and then became, as part of that, we created a bunch of these STEM role model posters, which we got translated into 8 languages and shared all around the world, and were downloaded over 1 million times. Last year, we made a bunch of podcasts. Or the last couple of years, we've been making a bunch of podcasts. The one top left, go with me on this, was an educational one. The one in the middle, Brief History of Stuff, is something that we made for the Science Museum. And the one on the right was about innovators talking about the innovators who inspired them. So, say, for example, Lem Cisse talking about Bob Marley, and it was a different one each episode. At the bottom is a podcast series we made last year for Water Aid, which was called Very Necessary, in which each episode a celebrity picked an object that they couldn't live without, and then we sent a writer off to find out an interesting story to tell about that object, and they would then come back and tell that story to the guest who picked the object. So quite recently we've been asked to develop a couple of formats around objects, stories of objects. Very Necessary is one of them, and A Brief History of Stuff was a similar one that we made for the Science Museum, which was hosted by Nahal. Except for this one, we were talking about objects in their collections. So telling the story of the vacuum cleaner, things like that. And we are obsessed with formats. My background is radio. Before Story Things, I spent 15 years working at the BBC. And my partner, Matt Locke, spent 7 years at the BBC and about 5 or 6 years at Channel 4. And so formats for radio shows, or formats in general, was very much a big part of how we thought back then. But what was really interesting is when we stepped out of radio and started working with different clients and talked about formats, they didn't quite understand what we meant by format. They they thought, first of all, we were talking about the actual format, for example, a video, which might be a MOV format, or a format for a picture might be a JPEG. So that's kind of one use of the word format. Some people think quite broadly in terms of format, such as an interview podcast or an interview show. An interview show is a format in itself. Sorry, I've just found out that my slides aren't changing. Are they changing now? There we go. We'll keep it like this. So an interview is a format. A documentary is a format, and that's right. But we kind of like to think as formats as being something a little bit more structured than just a format, because within the interview format, you can have different kinds of formats, and I'll come to that a little bit later on. So because we were a little bit fascinated by this, about a year or two ago, I started thinking, well, I really want to find out who is writing about formats in a really, really interesting way. So I went looking around and I just couldn't really find any good writing. Most of the writing about formats came from the world of TV, and it was about which formats were being sold to different territories and how much they were being sold for. So I decided to start something myself, and it's called Formats Unpacked, and it's kind of weekly, but it's not weekly because I can never just get it out on a weekly basis. So it's an occasional newsletter in which either myself or an industry expert unpacks a favorite format. And that format can be in any medium whatsoever. So it can be a TV or video, or it can be a comic format, or it can be we've had infographics deconstructed, we've had joke format. So any kind of format, any kind of structure that formats a piece of content is up to be unpacked for Formats Unpacked. So before going any further, just subscribe to that now. It's formatsunpacked.com. And if anyone ever fancies writing or unpacking a favorite format, you're more than welcome to do so. I'm trying to think of podcast formats that I've done. I did anthems recently. Someone is just about to do Desert Island Discs. And anyway, you're more than welcome to unpack one for me. So when I think of formats, I think of them as a repeatable structure that provides a foundation for stories to be built upon over and over again. So for me, the format is the bones of the thing. It's the scaffolding that everything is built around. The scaffolding remains the same all the time, and everything around it changes per episode. And this has been going on for, formats are everywhere. We just don't always see them. They've been present in storytelling since the very first stories were told. These are 8-story structures that are quite common story structures you might be familiar with, but ultimately these are just formats for stories. These are, there's the man in the whole story where the main character gets into trouble and then gets out again and ends up better off as a result of the experience. There is the Cinderella story where it was the similarity between the shapes of Cinderella and the New Testament that thrilled Kurt Vonnegut. So these are Kurt Vonnegut's ideas. This is what Kurt Vonnegut kind of came up with. He kind of sees the Cinderella and New Testament as being really, really similar stories. So these structures are everywhere. You may be familiar with the hero's journey. I won't go into it now, but if you're not familiar with it, just make a note of it. And when we're finished, just go Google it and then have a look at how many films or books or TV shows that you've seen that kind of follow that structure. So in the world of podcasting, I kind of think that, there are light touch formats and there are heavy touch formats, and it's not that any of these are better than the other. It's just, I thought I'd kind of do this scale before we started today to give you an idea of what I think a light touch format and what a heavy touch format is. So if we think of something like The Happy Place, which is Fern Cotton's podcast, it's a conversation. So it's an interview structure. Each episode is Fern talking to a guest, and they talk about a wide range of things, but very little happens in between. It's a conversation. Then you've kind of got your storytelling structures, such as the missing crypto queen, or ear hustle. Crypto queen is a structure which tells over multiple episodes. Ear hustle, might have different stories per episode, but it's broadly storytelling. Then you get slightly more formatted, which is podcasts such as You're Wrong About, which is a storytelling podcast, but the structure in the podcast is you thought you knew this, but you're wrong about it. Here's why you're wrong about it. And then they tell the story. So it's only a slight change in the format, but it's only a slight format point, but I think it's a big thing. It really draws you in, the fact that, every single story they tell, you're going to be surprised that there was more to that story than you thought. So if I give you an example, if you've not heard this podcast, I'll give you an example. Today I listened to the Tom Cruise jumping up and down on the sofa in front of Oprah episode. And what you're wrong about there is that Tom jumping up and down on the sofa wasn't quite as random as it seemed. It was kind of an in-joke between him and Oprah. So go and listen to that episode and you'll find out a little bit more of that. If we start moving towards the more heavier end of the format structure, you have things like anthems, which every episode, it's a very solid, it can, range in time from 8 to about 12 minutes, but it's a manifesto, effectively. It's an essay every single episode. Off Menu is an interview format, so similar to The Happy Place. The difference is that all the guests have to choose their perfect meal. And then we get to like the super heavy structured format, such as Desert Island Discs. And Desert Island Discs is every episode, and has been for 80 years. It's, pick your 8 favorite records that you take to a desert island. You can bring a book, you can bring a luxury item, and you can pick your favorite record at the end if you had to. So really, really strict, solid rules are what make Desert Island, this end of the format scale. So now you can see what I mean by, what is a light format and what is a heavy format. And so I thought it'd be really good to kind of make that definition now, so that as we go through some of the following points, you'll get a sense of why I think strong formats have something about them that really attract listeners. And it's not to say that the more popular or the better, but there is just something that hooks listeners in a way that some of the lighter formats don't. The lighter formats might rely more on a celebrity or rely more on story than the format itself. So I just thought there's 2 things I'm going to do next. I'm going to talk to you about 6 reasons, not 5 reasons, not 3 reasons or 10, but 6 reasons why I think developing formats is a really good thing to do. And then after this, I'm going to give you 6 things I've learned from my year or 2 of producing Formats Unpacked. So the very first reason why I think formats are brilliant is they provide a map to guide new listeners or new viewers or new readers or new players through a show or a feature or a game. As you're all possibly radio or podcast makers, let's just say they provide a map for new listeners to guide them through a show. And what I mean by that is, because the structure is so solid, once you've watched it once, or once you've listened to it once, you get a pretty good idea what is going to happen in the next episode. So you only really need to see who is the guest or what, who is starring in that next episode. So an example would be, if you're familiar with 73 questions to a new viewer might seem quite overwhelming, but once you've seen it and you know the structure and you know the pace of it and you know the type of questions that get asked, you know instantly that, those questions with Gaga are going to be quite fun. You're going to fly through it. It's going to be well choreographed, the whole thing. It's, you've already got that roadmap in your head. You know exactly where you're going. And our brains love that. Our brains spend, if you're watching a TV show or a murder mystery or something, your brain spends the entire time trying to work out what is going to happen next and try to try to guess what the rest of the show looks like. With formats, that does the heavy lifting for you. Your brain is kind of delighted because it knows where it's going next. Repetition and rhythm create familiarity. What I mean by that is, as you watch something over and over again, you become really familiar with not just the sound of it or the look of it, but any little part of it becomes recognizable. So I've never seen James Corden's TV show that this comes from, but I just know that's carpool karaoke. I don't need to be told anything else. I don't need the name of it. I just know that when you've got James Corden positioned in a car next to Britney Spears, that's Britney, isn't there? They're doing carpool karaoke. So the familiarity, really, really kind of, it hooks listeners in or viewers in or captures people's attention in ways that non-formatted shows don't. So I think for me, this is possibly one of the key points. I think for formats, audiences come for the format and stay for the story. And what I mean by that is, when you have a format, you're probably going to change the story every time, in that James Corden, as we saw there, has got exactly the same structure, but he's changing the story by having a different song and a different guest every episode. All he has to do is pour in the celebrity, pour in the song, and everything's done. The songs and everything's done for him. And people are coming for the actual structure in itself. They're not coming because they just know it's going to be James Corden and it's going to be Britney Spears. They're coming for the whole thing. And I think the greatest example of this is mentioned it earlier. Make no apologies for mentioning Desert Island Discs twice, but this weekend Desert Island Discs celebrates 80 years of broadcasting, and that's kind of quite incredible. And it is a bit of a cliche about Desert Island Discs that you don't go to Desert Island Discs for the guests. You don't have to know who the guest is. You're going because the structure is so fantastic. The structure is fantastic, and that you're going to hear really, really good stories in between. I kind of talk about you're definitely not going for the music, because a lot of the music that gets played in it really is kind of quite terrible and not my taste of music. But the music are the hooks that the stories are hung upon. And what I mean by that is as a football fan, I've heard Ian Wright being interviewed hundreds of times in my lifetime, but I've never heard him telling the stories of his childhood that he told when he was on Desert Island Discs. I've never been brought to tears before by Ian Wright in interviews, except for when he was telling us about the stories of his mum and dad when he was young. And that's it. The songs get the stories out of the people in ways that just a straightforward interview probably couldn't. So, people come for the structure, but stay for the stories. Formats make production easier. I mean, most of the clients that we make podcasts for, we make them seasonally. And a lot of the time, it might be a 1 season and a 2 season thing. And then that's it, it's done. And we have to come up with a whole new idea for the next thing. Convincing clients sometimes to invest in a long-term podcasting strategy where you can see the format running for years is quite tough. But when you do, it just makes production a lot easier, because you're not having to rethink the whole thing every single time you get to a new season. And this is the shipping forecast, and this is almost as old as the BBC. And if you don't know how to make the shipping forecast now and you're at the BBC, then you've got problems, because it just must be the easiest show on the planet to make. I mean, they've got 98 years or however long they've been making the shipping forecast. So sticking to something and doing it over and over and over again, you become brilliant at it. As a production team, it becomes really, really easy. If you have, a certain percentage of your show, it's not full of interchangeable parts. If a majority of your show is staying the same, then it becomes a hell of a lot easier to make. Formats can be brands within shows. I made no apology before for mentioning Desert Island Discs twice, but I've just realised that I've mentioned James Corden twice, which I will apologise for here. But Carpool Karaoke is a brand within itself that came from a different TV show. Similarly, I can't remember their names. Goodness me, I am tired this evening. Similarly, the show that this came from, you know who it is. Sorry, I can't. I tell you what, someone in the chat tell me the names of these two now. Anyone? Oh, come back to me in a minute. So formats can be a brand within a show. So if you have a show that has a particular segment in it that becomes really, really popular, then you can spin that out as a format in itself. It can become a show of its own. And finally, by staying the same, formats can document change. Someone's answered my question. Commode, Mark Commode. How could I not remember that? Sorry about that. By staying the same, formats can document change. And I think this is really interesting. I think, after Desert Island Discs, this genuinely has become one of my favorite formats in recent years. It just absolutely blows me away. And in fact, when I started Formats Unpacked, this was the very first format I wrote about, simply because it's a really simple idea. You interview someone and you do exactly the same interview 12 months later, and you interview the same person 12 months later again. And when we work with clients, we talk about publishing rhythms. Most people think of publishing rhythms as you'd publish a podcast once a week or once a fortnight. But we work with different clients who have different needs, and sometimes they might publish something monthly, sometimes quarterly, and some clients might publish something annually, such as an annual report. And I think that this is a really brilliant example of how a format can document change in a really, really interesting way. In the context of working with business clients, for example, it could be how a CEO documents the changes that they plan to make over a year, time and time again. I think it's just really, really interesting. And I'm a little bit obsessed with how stories can be told over a long period of time. Think about the 7-Up series is one of the greatest formats ever as well. So telling stories over a long period of time is a really, really interesting thing to do, I think. So just gonna have a drink of water, and then I'm gonna give you 6 things I learned about brilliant formats from some of the people who wrote really interesting things about Formats Unpacked. So this was a format called The And. It's a YouTube series, and the idea of The And is 2 people who have some sort of relationship with each other. So it might be boyfriend and girlfriend, husband and wife, father and son. It could be any kind of relationship whatsoever. And they both have a set of cards in front of them, and they have to take it in turns to pick up a card and ask the other person the question that's on the card. And the really interesting thing I learned from this format is that the answer to a question can change depending on who the interviewer is. We tend to think that an interview should stay the same for every episode of a podcast, but it might be interesting to think about, well, what happens if you bring in a different interviewer for each episode, or you bring in an interviewer to ask a particular question, or an interviewer does a particular part of the episode. There are different ways of thinking about that. And Katie Connolly, who wrote this Formats Unpacked for me, said, it's much harder to lie, sugarcoat, or bluff when being looked directly in the face. by someone who knows you. Watch this live editing here of a deck. There we go. Yeah, it's much harder to lie when it's someone that knows you. So really thinking about who could be doing the asking the questions is a really nice twist on an interview format, I think. You can tell the biggest stories in the smallest of ways. So this was the history of the world in 100 objects. It's about 10 or 11 years old now, this project. I was at the BBC just when it was kicking off, and it was really, really hugely successful. And it's a mammoth undertaking to try and tell the history of the world in 100 objects. But what was great about this project was they kind of leaned into the idea of giving yourself restrictions. If you're not familiar with this idea, sometimes giving yourself a couple of restrictions is a really good way to drive your creativity. And that's what they did here. They decided to tell the history of the world in just 100 objects. And the episodes that they made for radio were really short. This was unpacked for me by James Craig, who said this series sets out to represent humanity with a collection of objects that wouldn't fill your garage, then summarizes their significance in less time than it takes to cook your oven chips. So I really like that idea of giving yourself, a set of restrictions to tell huge stories. Find an existing format and take the boring bits out. So I'm no fan of cricket. I like sports, but I've always really, really struggled with cricket. And I kind of heard of 2020 cricket, but I didn't quite know what it was until Richard Gillis unpacked it for me. And 2020 cricket is basically, as he says there, it's an existing format with all the boring bits taken out. So instead of the game lasting for 4 or 5 days or however long cricket goes on for, it's all 20 overs. So it's over and done with in a couple of hours, which for me sounds great. As Richard said, it's for people who don't like cricket, and it's been the most influential sporting format of the last 20 years. So, do podcasts really have to be 30 minutes long? Do they have to be 60 minutes long? Can you get them down? What are the unnecessary bits? Do you need intros and outros that you're using? Can you just get straight into it as quickly as possible? It's worth having to think about. Mash it up. So A House Through Time is a really, really interesting TV show which tells the history of a house in a particular area, but gives a really, really fascinating, it tells the story through looking at historical documents and looking through data of the house and the area at the time. And I just think it's a really, really fascinating format. It's kind of like a mashup format. It's a little bit like Who Do You Think You Are, but for houses. But Lindsay Martinson, who unpacked this for me, said, this series allows you to oogle around a lovely old house whilst learning, making you feel more cultured and less guilty. So it's kind of like, it's a snooping format. It's a home decor format, and it's a history format, all rolled into one. And I wouldn't feel guilty about watching that at all. It's a fantastic show, and it's a mashup format. So think about what formats you can bring together and mash up in an interesting way. Ask one simple question and get multiple stories. So this is a Radio 4 show called, I think it's called Where Are You Going? And each episode they will go to a different city. I think it might have started off in the UK and then took it around the world. But they just they stand on a street corner and ask one simple question. They'll stop someone and say, where are you going? And from that one question unfurls all these stories about people's days, people's lives, what their days look like. This was unpacked for me by Ian Saunders, and he said, within busy streets all over the world, we are surrounded by a rich seam of human stories. This question is the axe that chips into that seam. And I really, really love that idea of a question being an axe that chips into a seam, like just one question. And again, this kind of goes back to taking the boring bits out. You don't need 10 questions. Sometimes you just need one question. And, you're in a certain situation, and with the right question, you can chip into that rich seam of human stories. So think a little bit about how you can how you can do that. What is the one question that will unpack multiple stories? And finally, a subtle change can bring a new kind of attention. So you may be familiar with CBeebies bedtime stories, and a couple of years ago they did something really interesting. They had a subtle change. That change was not necessarily in the stories, but who was reading the stories, and it was really, really, really popular for various reasons. And Robin Collins, who unpacked this for us, said, "You see, when it comes to its choice of male celebrity guests, the show has a habit of being incredibly tongue-in-cheek. Tom Hardy, bedtime story, New Year's Eve. You're welcome." So really thinking about this, even the most subtlest of changes can send your listening figures or viewing figures in that instance through the roof. So if you would like to see more thinking and see more people who are much smarter than me unpacking formats, go to Formats Unpacked, subscribe, and I'll try and get them out as regularly as possible. And again, if you want to unpack a format, please just get in touch with me. My email address is hugh@storythings. And I'm always around to answer any questions. If we don't get to chat now, I'm always around to answer questions throughout the week. Just ping us a message, and yeah, I'll try and help you unpick a format. So that's my talk done, Sarah. Shall we do some questions? Okay, so Kat Molesworth has asked, what format trends do you see becoming big in the next couple of years? I think podcasts are, and this is just my opinion, but I would like to see podcasts getting even longer at one end and even shorter at the other end. I would like to see the podcasts that are getting longer at this end getting longer because they're getting smarter and they're not just people waffling on and on and on. And I think podcasts will get shorter at this end, not necessarily because of the myth that people's attention spans are getting shorter, which I don't believe in any way whatsoever. But I think there are more opportunities for audio to fit. There are more places for audio to fit now than just the podcast stream, so to speak. So I think audio is getting really interesting. I think people are experimenting with audio in quite a few interesting ways now. Journalism is experimenting with audio, thinking about how it works for in different contexts. So yeah, I think podcasts may get shorter, but not because they're being dumbed down or because people believe that they have to be short, but because they are fitting into people's lives. So people ask all the time, what is the ideal length for a podcast? And as far as I'm concerned, it all depends on who's listening to it and where they want that podcast to fit into people's lives. So there was an interesting podcast experiment a few years ago, I don't know if it's still going, by Gimlet, who made a podcast format which was for a smart speaker, which was sponsored by, can't remember who the actual company it was sponsored by, but it was designed around making young children brush their teeth. So the parent would shout at their smart speaker to play the podcast, and the podcast would last the amount of time it takes to brush your teeth. And whilst that was playing, whilst you were brushing your teeth, the podcast would do nursery rhymes and give you some sort of quiz question at the end of it. And you got the answer to that quiz question when you and your children brushed your teeth at the end of the day, just before you went to bed. And so these podcasts were about 3 to 4 minutes long, each, top and tailing each end of your day. And that's what's really interesting about podcasts. we fit them into the space that we have to fit them into. I listen to podcasts when I go to the gym or when I'm running or whatever. Very rarely do I listen to podcasts when I'm working. So yeah, that's how I fit them in. So Max, apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Max. Max Gadenier. Podcasts have been around for quite some time now, but only started booming during the last 5 to 6 years. How will they keep evolving and stay relevant as a format? And what's your process for brainstorming different formats and deciding the right fit? Okay, so I think I kind of answered, I think I answered the first bit in the last question. I think podcasts will keep evolving if they really begin to understand how people are choosing to fit them into people's lives. And our process for brainstorming is we have a couple of processes, but one process that we have, and we work with clients, so a lot of it is, it's not like we're sitting down and developing our own IP here. So the very beginning of our process with clients isn't what stories have you got, let's tell them. It is, what is the behavior that you want to see? Why do you feel the need to release something into the world? And sometimes those behaviors it's about changing an opinion. It might be getting someone to vote. It might be getting someone to sign up to something. It might be getting to learn about something. So people have lots of different behaviors that our clients have lots of different behaviors. So then we kind of say, okay, well, who are the people that can make that happen? There's no point in, just making a podcast and not thinking about, well, who can make that behavior happen? So that is the next most important thing. Before we get into stories, who are the people that can make the behavior change? And then once we know that, we then start to look at their habits. So are they listening to podcasts? If they're not listening to podcasts, then maybe we shouldn't do a podcast. If they are listening to podcasts, what kind of podcasts are they listening to? Are they listening to long ones, short ones? How are those podcasts fitting into their lives? And then once we know that, that's when we start thinking about the format and starting to say, well, what other kinds of formats have they has had an impact that has had an impact in creating this behavior change. So we leave the format, towards the end. And once we do get to the format, we run what we call a Formats Unpacked workshop, whereby we get a bunch of formats and we ask the question, what's the magic that makes this special? And so having gone through 10 different formats, we've come out with 10 pieces of magic that we think makes it special. So for Desert Island Discs, it might be, the hook to hang stories on, the music of the hooks to hang stories. And then we'll sit down and we'll go, well, okay, well, how else do you hang stories? What else can you hang stories on? So that's kind of like a very, very quick answer to, to how we develop formats. How important is the scripting for a podcast? What do writers have to keep in mind when they work in this medium? Any good examples? Yeah, I think it's really, so certain podcasts need more writing than others. So if it's a straightforward conversation, then it needs, if it's a straight conversation between a host and a guest, then it needs less writing than a podcast that might have multiple guests and a narrator. In terms of what writers, what they have to keep in mind, I think the most important thing to keep in mind, I think, is when you write a line, why are you writing the line and how is it moving the story forward in any way? Because if that line isn't moving the story forward, you can lose that line. So when I talked about taking the bits out that you don't need, can podcasts be longer without being, can you make smarter, longer podcasts? What I mean by that is that when it comes to storytelling, it's really important to have a really solid structure when you're going into that writing process and know where your story is moving to and where it's going next. So just when you're writing, just make sure that you can see 1, 2, 3 steps ahead of you. And every single thing that you're writing is a very essential step on the journey to getting you to that point. Because if it's not, you are borrowing airtime from the audiences that, they've very kindly given you. And if you waste that airtime, then it's very hard to get them back. So just really thinking about how you make that story flow and how you get that structure. I hope that helps. So there's a question on slow TV was a thing. Any comment on slow podcasts, field recording podcasts, durational, unedited conversation? Yeah, they're all fantastic, and there's an audience for them. As I said before, as I was saying before, podcasts are about how they fit into people's lives. So a couple of years ago, I was working with a client, and I showed a little bit of research that said podcasts are listened to. I can't remember. There's a really high percentage of podcasts that I listen to at home, and it really surprised me because I very rarely listen to podcasts at home. And then someone said, "Oh, well, I listen to podcasts at bedtime." And then I thought, of course, I do listen to podcasts every single night at bedtime. And then that got us into a conversation about how one of the annoying things about listening to podcasts at bedtime is you fall asleep and then I never go back. I never go back to the podcast the next day, even though I've missed half of it. I don't know why. Silly of me to very rarely go back. So that kind of got into a conversation about how do you develop a podcast that you meant to fall asleep to, that isn't necessarily something to help you fall asleep, but if you did fall asleep, it doesn't matter. The structure of it means that you haven't missed anything crucial. So I think there is definitely a space for more interesting and innovative and fascinating slow TV type of podcasts. I think it's great, and I love to see people experimenting in that way. So yeah, please, if you've got an idea and you think it's a terrible idea and no one will listen to it, just do your research, start speaking to people. Would you listen to a podcast that does this? I never listen to podcasts when I'm working because my brain needs to be in a certain space, but there are certain tasks that I do that I don't need 100% attention. So is there a podcast that can fill that gap in some way? Do you have an idea that is for partial attention during the workday? If so, develop it, start speaking to people. But yeah, please, if you've got those ideas, keep at them. There's definitely audiences for them. Any more questions? Has anyone got a favorite format? Everyone listening, what's your favorite format? Anything? I think that might be it then. So are there any formats that work better for certain age groups, younger people? I wouldn't necessarily say it's about formats. I would say it's more about subject matter and talent and voices that you're using. Just really, really thinking about that. Who is it that, who are the guests that you may have on? What the subject? What are the stories that you're telling about? Can people see themselves in these stories? Does it reflect their lives in any way whatsoever? Is the host someone that they recognize from someone else? Just really, really thinking about that. But yeah, I think more importantly, thinking about the stories. Do the stories reflect the lives and the lives of the listeners that you want to attract? How do you see the benefits of posting podcasts onto normal pod platforms and YouTube, both audio and video? I know it's kind of a question that gets asked a lot. The only The only answer I can give to that is it's about, first of all, time. Do you have the time and energy to post it onto YouTube? My anecdotal evidence is that, I've got 3 children, and a lot of the time they're talking to me about podcasts and the videos that they've watched on YouTube, but they're podcasts ultimately that have been filmed and put on YouTube. So they've found an audience, they found a younger audience, and they've got that audience watching and listening instead of just listening. So I don't really have any personal feelings on that. If it brings more of an audience, then great. So I asked about favorite podcasts, and Ross Hembest said Radiolab have so many amazing pods worth checking. Radiolab was one of the very first podcasts I ever fell in love with. I just think it's an absolute wonder, and for a long time it became my obsession as to how do you tell stories with sound in the same way that they do. And when I talk about sound, I'll talk about sound design rather than just the story itself. I think that's incredible. Cap Molesworth, interview or discovery, basically being nosy. Interview or discovery, basically being nosy. Sorry, I'm not quite sure I get that. Sorry, Kat. And Who Wants to Be a Millionaire as a format? Yeah, you can't really argue with that. It is a pretty solid format. Love that myself. So fab. So a message from Sarah Radiolab, the episode with the singing colours. So if you're not familiar with Radiolab, just please go out and try and listen to an episode and try and listen to one of the earliest episodes. And I remember when it launched, people got quite angry because they felt that the sound got in the way of the storytelling and it's too gimmicky. It was too gimmicky, but once you can kind of get over that and you can start to appreciate what sound can do in terms of telling a story, it really is something else. Sorry, Kat, I now get it. Yeah, sorry, interview or discovery, basically being nosy formats is what you're saying. Mark Cunningham, my favorite 10 Things That Scare Me is a tiny podcast about our biggest fears. Yeah, I mean, again, a brilliant tiny podcast, a brilliant short podcast. So if you're not familiar with it, one person, talks about the tiny thing that scares them or the thing that scares them. Yeah, great. I just really, really like short podcasts. It's really funny because I've spent such a long time saying to people, don't get suckered into believing that attention spans are getting shorter. And it's not that short podcasts are being designed for the shorter attention spans. It's just that they, for a long time they were an hour long and that's all you got. And then all of a sudden people said, well, let's try short ones. And they just became really interesting. Ross, in talking about Radiolab, said, what about the Bolero episode? I don't think I've heard the Bolero episode. Oh man, that's one I'm gonna have to find and listen to. We're going right down a Radiolab rabbit hole here, aren't we? Are there any more questions? Is there anything else I can help you with? Well, there are no more questions. So thank you so much for turning up tonight. This is my first one. I found it a little bit weird because for some reason I was expecting a Zoom call and to see you all, and that didn't happen. And apologies for the technical difficulties at the beginning. I hope you all enjoyed it. As I said, my email is hugh@storythings.com. If you want to get in touch, I'm always happy to chat about formats or other things. I'd love to hear what you're up to. And yeah, just keep doing the great work you're all doing. And thank you for being curious enough to tune in tonight. So